We will now have the book launch of Narrativizing Bharatavarsha and Other Essays, followed by a lecture by Professor Saumya Dey. Dr. Saumya Dey is a professor at Rashram School of Public Leadership and holds a PhD from the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. His primary research interests are intellectual and cultural history. He has, till date, authored 3 books: Becoming Hindus and Muslims, Reading the Cultural Encounter in Bengal, 1342 to 1905, The Cultural Landscape of Hindutva and Other Essays, Historical Legitimacy of an Idea, and Narrativizing Bharatavarsha and Other Essays. We will now have the unveiling of Narrativizing Bharatavarsha and Other Essays, after which Professor Saumya Dey will deliver his lecture on trends and practices in Indian historiography.
Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me clearly. So, as you've learned, I teach at the Rashram School of Public Leadership, which is one of the schools, academic schools of Rishihut University. And Rishihut University, as you know, is academic partner to Pondicherry Litfest. We are a new institution, and we call ourselves a social impact institution. The idea is to produce research and to put out academic programs which are relevant to societal needs and address the societal needs. Not to do scholarship for its own sake, that is. So the theme for this talk, the theme for this lecture is trends and practices in Indian historiography. I shall try to speak for about 20 odd minutes so that we have a little time left for an interaction or a Q&A session. Now, let me forewarn that this is going to be a rather pedantic talk. But then you cannot avoid pedantry when you bring up a topic like this. So I shall refer to academic works and monographs every now and then. I shall bring up historians and their approach towards Indian history. And by the way, let me also clarify that when I say Indian historiography, I do not necessarily mean only works by Indian historians. That is, works by Indians on Indian history. I shall bring up a few British historians too. And I shall also refer to a British school of historiography pertaining to Indian history towards the end of my talk. Now, pardon me. First things first, I'm an academic historian in the sense that I've been trained to be a historian. I understand that academic historians do not enjoy a very good reputation these days anymore, and that is due to understandable reasons, of course. But let me, to begin with, clarify what do we mean by historiography as academic historians. To put it very simply, historiography is the art, science, or craft, whatever you term it, of conducting historical inquiries and writing histories. And how do you conduct historical inquiries? There are 2 aspects. to the process. First is that you consult primary sources, which is archival documents or travelogues, let us say the travelogue by Huan Sang or Bernier, and so on, which we term primary sources. And then we consult, then we look up secondary material or secondary sources, which is works by other historians previously produced in a particular area, in a period that we have taken up. So this is historiography. A topic like this is, of course, enormous. It could be the subject of multiple PhDs and multiple monographs. So, perforce, this will be a rather sketchy presentation. Please pardon me for this. If you're familiar with the area, probably you might find me wanting. But then we are short of time here. Now, the dominant trend or the dominant practice in Indian historiography has, of course, been the Marxist one, right, since independence. And the Marxist school of historiography was, interestingly, founded by a mathematician. But more on this later. The most important Marxist historians have been, since the 1960s or 70s, individuals such as Romila Thapar, D.N. Jha, R.S. Sharma, etc. And for a long time, their scholarship on ancient India was the last word. Now, these people, of course, interpret ancient India in a strictly materialist frame. That is the dominant framework of a Marxist scholarship. What do I mean when I say materialist frame? Well, they understand history or historical causation, development in terms of class formation, stratification, as they call it, configuration of classes in a particular society in terms of the dominant classes and the dominated classes, the exploiter classes and the classes which are exploited, the forces and relations of production, and so on. And by the way, a while ago I mentioned that this school of scholarship, interestingly, was founded by a mathematician. D.D. Kosambi was his name. And the Kosambi's idea of history was that it is the gradual movement, the gradual progression of forces and relations of production. So the Marxist school of historiography primarily understands history, historical causation in terms of material production and the forces in terms of classes and means of production involved in material production. Now, going back, returning to these people, D.N. Jha, R.S. Sharma, Romila Thapar, etc., when they study state formation in ancient India, for instance, they understand the state formation in ancient India in terms of stratification. Their argument is that, certain Varnas, the upper Varnas, the Kshatriyas, Brahmins, etc., they cornered a greater portion of the social surplus, that is the resources of a society, and they arrogated to themselves a dominant position in society, and thus they became the ruling class. This is their understanding, interpretation of the state formation process in ancient India. Now, the thing about the Marxist understanding of state formation is that they understand the state in terms of domination relations. The domination relations are a very key concept, a fundamental concept in Marxist historiography. State societies are primarily configurations of the dominant and the dominated classes. The state in Marxist materialist understanding is not the outcome. I'm emphasizing the word not here. In a Marxist understanding, in a Marxist framework, the state is not the outcome of a cultural imagination or a moral imagination. They have a very cynical understanding of state and state societies, as they call them, and they understand state societies in terms of domination relations. So their understanding of the ancient Indian state is not a cultural or a moral one. It is primarily a material one. Moving on to other aspects of their historiography and their narrativization of ancient India, they, of course, accept the Aryan invasion theory or a slight inflection modification of the Aryan invasion theory, which is the Aryan migration theory. And they also posit a determinate rupture between what they term the Harappan and the Aryan periods, Indo-European periods in Indian history. They do a materialist interpretation, they do a materialist examination of the hymns of the Rig Veda, and they argue that the Vedic period, as they call it, was without civilization, as they understand it, in the sense that there were no exchange networks, by which they mean trade. There was no trade as such. There was no craft production on a large scale as such. That is why there was no trade. There was no commodity exchange on a large scale, once again, which is also why trade was absent. The dominant mode of the economy was pastoral. The Vedic people, as they termed them, they were pastoralists, they were herders, they were cattle herders, and by the way, according to them, they consumed beef. So this is another aspect of their historiography. While positing a determinate rupture between the Harappan and the Vedic periods, they also insinuate that the Vedic cultural imagination or Vedic religious practices were actually at variance with modern Hinduism. And they repeatedly insinuated that beef consumption was an orthopraxis. By orthopraxis in history, we mean an established practice, a dominant practice. So this is another aspect of Marxist historiography that one ought to be mindful of. They posit a rupture between Hinduism and the Vedic religion, as they term it. Ancient India is predominantly presented as an atrocity narrative, as this time and place in which the dominant Varnas were ruthlessly exploiting the lower Varnas, the Vaishyas, the Shudras, etc. And all achievements of ancient India in linguistics, in astronomy, in mathematics, in architecture, etc., in literature definitely, are obfuscated by them. They do not refer to these achievements, which is also why, as I mentioned a while ago, ancient India is predominantly presented as an atrocity narrative in Marxist historiography. Moving on to early medieval period. Once again, the dominant historiography of early medieval period is Marxist. And what do I mean by the early medieval period? Well, roughly the centuries between the 8th and, or rather the centuries from the 8th till the 11th. 700s ACE, that is after Common Era, till 1000 ACE, after Common Era. Anyway, so this is the time period, this is the period rather, pardon me, this is the period that we refer to as the early medieval. And the entire postulate, the entire understanding of the early medieval in Marxist scholarship is built around the idea of Indian feudalism. And this idea was developed by R.S. Sharma. Now, how did Indian feudalism come to be? A very problematic idea, by the way. It is unsustainable upon empirical scrutiny, but Marxists are not terribly bothered about empiricism, actually. They only select the facts which suit their presentation of history. I mean, you might have heard about cutting a shroud to fit a corpse, but they're perfectly capable of actually chopping up a corpse to fit a shroud. If there's a finger sticking out, or pardon me, I'm sounding a little gross here, but if there's a finger sticking out or feet sticking out, they're perfectly capable of chopping them off so that the corpse fits the shroud. Anyway, to return to this construction of Indian feudalism, it has been done. It is the handiwork of this gentleman, Professor R.S. Sharma. So how did Indian feudalism come to be? According to him, towards the end of the Gupta period, towards the end of Gupta rule, the rulers made land grants in large numbers to Brahmins. And it was with two objectives. The first objective was, of course, expanding the arable, as we say in history writing, that is expanding cultivation. And secondly, these rulers were trying to deal with a major social dislocation. This is the idea proffered by R.S. Sharma. What was the social dislocation? The social dislocation was that the lower Varnas, the Vaishyas and Shudras, were getting a little recalcitrant, disobedient, that is, in relation to the higher Varnas, the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas. And they were unwilling in this period, according to R.S. Sharma, to discharge their regular servile functions. So Brahmins were dispatched to different parts, different corners of the Gupta kingdom with land grants, and police functions, administrative functions were alienated to Brahmins so that they bring these people under control, basically. Now, R.S. Sharma, by the way, he gets a little candid while relating this narrative. He actually confesses that he doesn't have a concrete empirical evidence to support this postulate. He builds this entire postulate on the basis of Puranic references or Puranic descriptions of the Kali age, in which this social dislocation is actually central. The idea that the Varnas, the lower Varnas, would be disobedient and they would be unwilling to discharge the servile functions relative to the higher Varnas. Anyway, a rare candid moment in Marxist historiography. Nevertheless, you can understand, you can imagine how hegemonic this historiography was once in the university circuits. It is still hegemonic, by the way, but once upon a time it was supremely hegemonic. And despite the fact that, Sharma actually owns up to his gaffe, quite candidly. Despite this, his books have been prescribed textbooks at DU and definitely at Jawaharlal Nehru University, where I did my PhD, at the Center for Historical Studies. Anyway, moving on, there is a slight corrective. The saving grace is that there is a slight corrective to the Marxist understanding of state and state formation. And this corrective has been provided by an American gentleman, if I remember correctly his nationality, Burton Stein. Burton Stein has an interesting idea upon the early medieval state, upon the Chola upon the Chola state and later the medieval state, the Vijayanagara state. He has done an extensive study upon these empires, and he has come up with the idea of the ritual segmentary state. Now, to put it very plainly for you, in his understanding, the state represents a moral imagination and a cultural imagination. To unpack further this concept and as to how he develops it, studying the Chola state, the Chola Empire rather, Burton Stein argues that the Chola emperor, the great Chola as he was called, exercised his suppressive authority only in Tanjavur, the Chola capital and its vicinity. That is, he exercised his police functions only in Tanjavur and its vicinity. The rest of the Chola kingdom was actually a conglomerate of sorts, of nadus. He terms them ethnic territories, where the dominant mode of production was the peasant economy. And in the context of this peasant economy, there were these local lineages, local chiefs, nayakas, and their families. And these lineages articulated with the authority of the great Chola, or rather they substantiated the authority of the great Chola in a ritual form, in a cultural form, in the sense that they emulated the role of the great Chola as the supreme patron of Brahmins, temples, and cows. So in this sense, the Chola state was integrated. Making sense? I hope it is. Never mind. So in this sense, the Chola state was integrated in a ritual framework, in a cultural framework. Similarly, the Vijayanagara kingdom, the Vijayanagara empire, in which case, according to Burton Stein, the annual Vijayadashami celebration actually played an important role in integrating the realm. It was an occasion on which the authority of the Vijayanagara ruler was broadcast across the kingdom in a ritual form. All the nayakas would be in attendance. They would substantiate royal authority and so on. Anyway, let us not go into all the nitty-gritty, but the point is that here the state, in Burton Stein's understanding, is the outcome of a cultural imagination of ritual functions, ritual performances, and it is a very important corrective to the Marxist understanding of the state, which is rigidly materialistic and is in terms of domination relations. Coming to medieval India, I shall conclude over the next 10 minutes or so. I understand this might not be terribly interesting for you. Anyway, it is, thank you. Moving on to medieval India, the historiography of medieval India is rigidly oriented towards Delhi. The historiography is centered around the Delhi Sultanate and later the Mughal Empire. For instance, what are termed local kingdoms or regional kingdoms, such as the Kakatiyas, they are not mentioned at all, barely mentioned. The Ahoms find no mention whatsoever, and so on. So this is a kind of historiography which is very imperial in its tone and tenor, in the sense that it focuses entirely on these imperial formations built around Delhi. The Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire are almost entirely studied from the administrative and economic points of view. They are studied in terms of their administrative and economic organization. The cultural element of these imperial formations, the cultural aspect of these imperial formations is completely ignored. For instance, historians of medieval India pretend as though Islam was not important to the Delhi Sultanate or the Mughal Empire, that they did not derive their moral rhetoric from Islam, or that Islam was not a motivator. for the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire. And of course, all instances of cultural oppression in medieval India are completely ignored, completely obfuscated. All the instances of temple destruction and desecration are ignored. If you go to Delhi, you know, some of you might have visited Delhi. The entire Qutb complex is actually constructed out of the masonry of a demolished Hindu and Jain temples. Very likely, you know, once upon a time it was a major Hindu-Jain temple complex, a ritual center. I mean, the part of Delhi where the Qutb complex is located is today known as Mehrauli. Mehrauli was originally called Mihirapura, if I remember correctly, as I've read in Professor Meenakshi Jain's monograph on this period, on this place. Anyway, so these are certain, you know, striking characteristics of the historiography of medieval India, that it is focused entirely on the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire, which are studied purely from an economic and administrative point of view. Their cultural aspect is ignored. However, if the cultural side of the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire is brought up at all, it is only in terms of imperial culture, that is the culture surrounding the throne, how deference was offered to the Sultan or the Badshah, what was the culture of the nobility, what were their cultural practices, etc., etc., what was cultural production like in the Mughal Empire in terms of dance, music, and so on. But culture in its religious dimension is ignored when these entities, such as the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire, are studied. The dominant accent of the scholarship, even in this case, even in this instance, is Marxist because it is materialist. All the influential, important scholarship in this context is again Marxist. I bring up a few monographs, for example, Irfan Habib's Agrarian History of the Mughal Empire, in which case he studies the Mughal administration in relation to the peasant economy. And by the way, it's a very candid account. He also owns up to the exploitation of the peasant economy by the Mughal Empire. It's a PhD, as I know, and when you write your PhD, you know, you have to be a little honest, per force, because many universities have open defense, public defense of PhDs, and then the thesis goes to 2 or 3 examiners. So in this case, he's quite candid every now and then. As about the decline and disintegration of the Mughal Empire, the historiography upon this theme too is Marxist, in the sense that it is economically deterministic. I bring up Muzaffar Alam's Crisis of Empire in Mughal North India. And according to Muzaffar Alam, the Mughal Empire began to disintegrate in the 18th century due to zamindari uprisings. And interestingly, according to Muzaffar Alam, despite all the instances of the exploitation of the peasant economy provided by Irfan Habib, as argued by him, the Mughal Empire actually made the peasant economy more prosperous. You know, the Mughal Empire brought a greater prosperity to the peasant economy, and this made the zamindars desire a greater share of the agrarian agricultural surplus generated by the peasant economy, which is why they rebelled in the 18th century in increasing numbers, and it caused the disintegration of the Mughal Empire. There is another monograph on the same theme, Satish Chandra's Parties and Politics in Mughal Empire. According to him, the Mughal Empire began to disintegrate due to a phenomenon called the Jagirdari crisis. There weren't enough Jagirs left to distribute among the Mughal nobility. I don't go into the details. I suppose I'm running out of time here. The bell is rung. Okay, so now I jump straight to the historiography of modern India or colonial India. This is an interesting realm, interesting terrain, by the way. Here I find 4 dominant trends. 2 of them Marxist, actually, variations of mutations of Marxist scholarship. One I call nationalist Marxist. You can also call it institutional Marxist. The other is a critical Marxist. The third one is the subaltern school. The fourth one is the Cambridge school. It is the Sahib's Englishman school. Now, to bring up the institutional Marxist point of view first, it was developed by Bipin Chandra, who was very loyal to the previous regime, to put it politely. He even justified the emergency, eloquently. Anyway, so this institutional Marxist point of view studies the freedom movement in terms of its class configurations. But at the same time, according to Bipin Chandra, the freedom movement was not dominated by a particular class, not by the bourgeoisie, There was instead a struggle for domination or hegemony upon the freedom movement. So his position is that it was a multi-class movement, and of course, eventually it was led by the Congress Party. So in his account of the freedom movement, it is the Congress Party which is leading it throughout, and his account of colonial India, of the freedom movement, in this sense becomes a biography of the Congress Party, of the Indian National Congress. The other position is the critical Marxist position. It is developed by Sumit Sarkar. He doesn't actually dilate on the class configurations within the freedom movement, but every now and then he insinuates that the freedom movement was manipulated by big capital, by the Birlas, by the way, who were very close to Gandhi. He every now and then makes this insinuation. Moving on to the subaltern school, according to them, the freedom movement was an elite initiative. It was an elite endeavor. It wasn't a popular movement, according to them. The freedom movement was a realm of politics in which there was a vertical split between the elite and the non-elite. The elite were in the institutional arena. They insinuated this. Well, the non-elite were dominated by impulse and violence. So if you see an impulsive, violent side to the freedom movement, it represents the non-elite side or the subaltern side. This is their position. Finally, concluding, coming to the Sahib's school, which is also called the Cambridge School. According to them too, internationalism was spurious in the sense that it was authored by the elite. It was elite endeavor. And the roots of this position, the basis of this position is traceable to a monograph authored by an Indian, interestingly, Anil Seal. But Indians become bigger sahibs than sahibs when they go abroad frequently. Yeah, that's true, unfortunately. So according to Anil Seal, Indian nationalism was the outcome of the presidency elites coming together gradually, coalescing gradually. The elites in the Bombay presidency, Bengal presidency, in the Madras presidency, founding organizations, voluntary associations, as they call them, such as the Indian Association, the Madras Mahajana Sabha, Bombay Association, and so on. And the eventual outcome of this gradual coming together, greater cooperation between the elites of the various presidencies was the Indian National Congress. Now, moving on to other Cambridge School historians, they are C.A. Bailey and Judith Brown. According to them, once again, Indian nationalism was spurious, and actually it represented factional interests, the interests represented by patron-client relations at the local level, in the neighborhoods, in the small towns, and so on. C.A. Bailey develops this position in an important monograph. It is prescribed when you are doing your master's. It is called, well, I have it written down here. It is called The Local Roots of Indian Politics, Allahabad, 1880 to 1920. So according to C.A. Bailey, the Congress, so to speak, struck roots in Allahabad city in the 19th century because it leveraged the local patron-client relations or networks. For example, it brought over the Muslim service class, which was in alliance with the Dargah keepers, who were their clients, and it brought over to its side the Kayasts, and the Brahmins, the Pragwal Brahmins, a subcaste of Brahmins dependent upon the Kayasts. Anyway, I'm providing a very sketchy picture of what he says in this monograph. The point to be noted is that, according to him, Indian nationalism wasn't nationalism at all. It was spurious. It was only the expression of these local patron-client relationships. They came on board the Congress to fulfill their personal, local agendas. Finally, to conclude, Judith Brown builds upon C.A. Bailey's position in a sort of a political biography of Mahatma Gandhi. It's very interesting, by the way. If you find it, do read it. It is called Gandhi's Rise to Power. According to her, Gandhi took over the Congress very quickly, by the way. He returned to India in 1915, and by 1918, the Congress had gone over to his point of view. He did this very quickly, according to Judith Brown, once again by leveraging the patron-client relations at the local levels. According to her, he worked his way into these local networks of power and influence. And he deployed in various parts of the country his subcontractors. The subcontractors is a concept that she develops, who leveraged these local networks of power and influence on his behalf. She identifies certain people as Gandhi subcontractors. At this point, I remember one name, Rajendra Prasad. I conclude here, and I may take a few questions. Please. Thank you.
such a lot. I have a long list of what to avoid now. But I just want to ask you in terms of correction, should it be replacement of content or should it be giving thinking habits to look at primary and secondary source? What is your approach to correction?
Yeah, that's right. So we have to go back to the go back to archival documents, go back to primary sources as far as possible. I mean, to give you a few instances, few examples of how Indian historiography has been less than truthful. I mean, we all learn in school and college that it was the Muslim League which demanded proportional representation on the communal basis first in 1906. The truth is that the Congress conceded the same very principle way back in 1889. In 1889, the Congress passed a resolution at its annual session, which actually conceded this idea in principle. So this is the extent to which, Indian historiography has been less than truthful, as I said. So we have to go back to archival texts as far as possible. And, well, this initiative has to come from professional academic historians because archival research takes a kind of training, which not everyone, I'm not being snobbish here. It is just that it requires a kind of training and you have to acquire it, you have to invest in it. You can't just walk into the archives and begin, delving into documents. So we have to go back to primary texts and as far as possible broaden our conceptual frameworks. I have no problem with, Marxist conceptual frameworks, the class struggle, etc. They do play a helping hand in terms of understanding historical possession, but we also have to bring in culture, mentality, cultural imaginations into our understanding of history, So historiography has to have this element of heteroglossia. Heteroglossia is a concept developed by Russian philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin, which means a multiplicity of voices. You have to bring a multiplicity of voices to our telling of history. Sorry, pardon me.
Yeah, so the question is on this historical sheet anchors. Thank you. The last few years, can you take us through the developments in the idea of historical sheet anchors? Because whatever little we understand as students, not of students of history, is the Western and the Marxist flawed idea of couple of critical sheet anchors has what has led to fast forwarding or post dating of many of the Indian events and kings. So has there been serious research as a resistance on sheet anchor question?
Not yet. I hope I understand you right. By sheet anchors, you mean the basic key concepts and dating.
Yeah, so particularly the dating of, identifying the Chandragupta Maurya and Devamshi Priyadarshi with Maurya, the Ashoka Maurya.
Yeah.
So, and then that leads to, for example, Shankaracharya himself, if we correct this, it goes back 2,500 years. So...
I understand, yeah. So, considerable amount of revision is required as far as this aspect of historiography is concerned, what you term sheet anchors, the basic concepts, the key texts and their dating, the key personages, the individuals and their dating. Again, well, the initiative has to come from the professional historians community because it takes multiple various kinds of training. For example, in handling coins, in numismatics, in epigraphy, in reading and deciphering inscriptions. And of course, in reading and deciphering ancient texts, which is not always easy, by the way. You can't just pick up the Arthashastra, untranslate it, and begin to make sense of it. The Sanskrit language has not been the same throughout the ages, for example. Vedic Sanskrit is sometimes termed a different language in its own right. There's this, I suppose, a Dutch Indologist he died some time ago. His name was Fritz Stahl. According to Stahl, the Sanskrit of the Vedas ought to be termed a different language altogether. He called it Vedic. But anyway, probably that was another agenda that he was pushing, that of, bringing about more ruptures in Indian history. But the point is that the initiative has to come from professional historians, and which is why, in academic spaces, we need heteroglossia, once again, multiplicity of voices, so that this very necessary revision in Indian history is carried out. Again, the thing with Western historians is that when it comes to Indian historical phenomena, they would ascribe them as late a date as possible. The Mahabharata is dated to the early centuries of the Common Era, 1st or 2nd centuries AD, as we said once upon a time. Some people would say, some Western historians would say, the Vedas did not assume their final form till as late as the 15th century AD, and so on. So they try to downplay the antiquity of Indian phenomena as far as possible. And the money comes from the West, that is where the where the most lucrative fellowships lie, the visiting professorships are there, and so on. So Indians sell out so very frequently. Anyway, so thank you very much. It's been great speaking before you. I must take off because I have a flight to catch. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Thanks a lot again.